Welcome to another digital discussion with the Milwaukee County Historical Society. My name is John Harry. So glad that you are with us tonight for our presentation on Milwaukee's LGBTQ Heritage History Unhidden with Michail Takach and Bjorn Nasett, who now I've been corrected on that. It's BJ Daniels. So we'll be talking with them in just a little bit as we get into this celebration of Pride Month at the Milwaukee County Historical Society. We're always looking for reasons to talk about the different diverse populations of Milwaukee, and we're so excited to have BJ and Michail with us tonight. Before we hand things over to them, I just want to kind of go through some announcements with the Historical Society. We are open downtown on Martin Luther King Drive. If you want to stop in, the parts of our feature exhibit for 2021 is up about water in Milwaukee. So you can come in. It's by donation. So come in if you've ever just wanted to look around. This is a great chance to look around the Historical Society right now. Also, we have some great summer tours as the world is reopening, and these are very safe options too, if that's still a concern of yours. So Milwaukee History Kayak Tours, which are led by our own archivist, Steve Schaffer. If you ever met Steve, there's never a dull moment. And so it's always fun to go out, especially on the water with Steve. And the Milwaukee Kayak Company is our partner with that. So you get to go on the various rivers of Milwaukee and learn the history from that point of view, which is a different perspective, absolutely. And if you don't have your sea legs, we do have things based on land as well. We have Milwaukee History Bike Tours. Our partner, Dana Hansen, who you might remember from when we had the Brew City Beer Museum. She leads those, and we've partnered with Bubbler Bikes. So you get a special deal on Bubbler Bikes for 24 hours too, to again, get out and see our wonderful city of Milwaukee while it's nice out. There'll be snow before you know it. So make sure that you get out and enjoy that. But we have a great presentation tonight. Like I said, we're celebrating Pride Month with Michail and BJ. And so let's bring them into the conversation. And Michail, if you want to share your screen now too, we'll get that going as well.
Sure.
But welcome to the program tonight, gentlemen. Excited to hear this presentation.
Thanks, John.
And I'll get your screen up there. And Michail, go ahead and share that full screen, and we'll be good to go.
Okay, one moment. Okay.
Oh, let's 1 second. We're seeing your presenter view, Michail. Sorry about that. Let's take that out of there for a second.
Okay, one moment.
Well, Michail's figuring a little stuff out. I forgot to mention one thing about the Historical Society too. We do have our podcast about the pandemic of 1918 that you can check out as well.
We were the healthiest city.
The healthiest city, yeah. It was that was the tagline. Wow. So Michail, I don't actually see anything all of a sudden. Not sure what's going on. In the setup menu, make sure you go to, so in the setup your slideshow, make sure it's presented for an individual. That's the trick.
Okay, one moment.
So sorry, everybody. Thanks for bearing with us for just a second.
Totally fine. Well worth the wait. I'm just saying, hold tight, everyone. You are going to love what we have to show you.
So maybe while we're getting this figured out, I don't know, BJ, are there things going on specifically in the community for Pride Month?
Well, there have been a lot of things. Milwaukee has always traditionally celebrated Pride Month the first weekend of June, so that was last weekend. And yes, many venues did numerous events all weekend long and really took care of Milwaukee's diverse LGBTQIA population. And everybody's having fun. But we are still celebrating Pride Month all along. I mean, that's kind of, I think, the whole point of the month is that we keep talking about it. But I think a lot of the events that are going on in the future are a little less intense than the ones that we had
everything
last
that's
weekend.
Been happening, right?
Right.
Absolutely.
So, no, things are great. I mean, people are out and about, and we made it, even last year during the pandemic, we were doing outdoor shows. I did like a Pride event at Hamburger Mary's in the parking lot where people could like drive in and like sit out in their car and order food and drive-in drag show. I mean, it was a way to get through it and still be able to bring the community together. And of course, there was the the Black Lives Matter March, the LGBT version, that was huge last year. So people always find a way. I think Milwaukee people have been activists for a long time and will find ways to show their presence.
Yeah, that's great. And like you said, like it was such a unifying atmosphere last summer around different social causes, which is, I think, overdue as well.
Well, and totally during a pandemic, and people to, take risks to protest and march and talk about equality and bring the LGBT community into the conversation. That was huge.
Yeah, absolutely. How we doing, Michael?
Are you able to see my screen now? Are you able to
we can see the presentation, but it's still in the view there. So I know this is going to be a little clunky here for a second, so bear with me. There should be a slideshow setup button in there. So sorry about this, everybody. Inside the PowerPoint app.
Okay, wait 1 second.
So put up just a quick banner here so people know what's going on.
Well, I think that's come to be sort of, expected in a lot of presentations.
Right. It's
just because of the way it has to all be done these days. So,
right.
But yeah,
there we go. We got it.
There we go.
There we go. All right, everybody. So you guys take it away. We'll do a Q&A at the end. Sorry about the technical mix-ups there, everybody. And like I said, put your questions in the comments. But Michael and BJ, take it away.
Yeah, many apologies. The issue is that I have so many screens, and you were only seeing the wrong screen. So this is what happens when you form a command center in your own home.
Real quick, Michael, hit the hide button on the little ribbon at the bottom of your screen there.
Okay.
There you go. Perfect. All right, now you're good to go.
Okay, so to start over, thank you for your patience, everyone. My name is Michail Takach. I'm the curator for the Wisconsin LGBTQ History Project. It's a project that I've been involved with since about 2008. I'm not the founder of the project by any means. The organization started in 1995 as a table exhibit at Pride Fest. So it was literally like, what we may see as like a high school science project. It really just started as a simple timeline and a bulletin board at Pride Fest. And in 2003, my colleague Don Schwam took the project online, and he made a website that has grown and grown and grown over the past 18 years and is now the state's largest digital repository of LGBTQ memorabilia, history, and heritage. If you haven't seen our website, please check it out. You can find it at either wislgbthistory.com or I believe mkelgbthistory.com. So that's your assignment for after the show. But for today, what we'll be talking about is Unhidden history and really the mission, the purpose, and really the reward of our project. Just a quick introduction to myself. I lived in Milwaukee for 40 years and currently live in Los Angeles. I still have a lot of family in Milwaukee and spend a lot of time there for a number of different project-related purposes. I'm a UW-Madison graduate. I'm a communications professional by trade. Everything that I'm sharing with you today was all the work of volunteers and not something that I was paid for. I'm also an author and a writer. The book that you see here is a book that you can buy at the Historical Society or online. It was published in 2015. And actually, it's really astonishing. Since we published the book in 2015, we've learned enough to publish an entirely separate book just on the topic of LGBT history alone, because we have unhidden that much history in the past 6 years. With that, I will turn it over to my co-host today, BJ Daniels.
Hi, everybody. I'm BJ Daniels, and my participation in this project with Michael started when he was doing his book that was released in 2015. And I had known him from Pride Fest, and I had been a participant at Pride Fest for a long time. So what happened was I told him that I had saved so many things, tons of photos and ephemera and clippings and videos and all these things So he ended up seeing some of the things that I have, and then we realized some were used in that book, and then we realized that we had enough material, of course, to make another book. And so we're going to be talking about that a little bit later too. So glad to be here.
Yes, so later on this year, BJ and I will actually be releasing a second book, the title of which is The Golden Age of Milwaukee Drag. And it focuses on the history of Milwaukee's drag performers going back to, wait for it, 1884, which is probably a surprising year to think about drag, but we'll have more on that later. But to dive into the presentation for today and to kind of captivate the audience, I'd like to start with a bit of a quiz. If you can use the chat for this and try to answer it. The question really is, when was the word gay bar first used in the Milwaukee media? And this is important for a number of different reasons, which we'll get into. But your options are 1961, 1971, or 1988. So if you can just quickly type your guess in the chat, we'll see if anyone gets it, and we'll explain why these dates are significant. So the answer is not 1988. 1988 was the year of the first Pride Fest, at least the first continuous Pride Fest. There had been Pride observations before, dating back to 1971, but Pride Fest, as we know it today, operated continuously from 1988 to 2019. Although there have not been Pride Fests for the past 2 years, it is expected to return in 2022. And the answer is not 1971 either. That was the year that Gay People's Union formed. Gay People's Union was the first formative social organization for gay and lesbian people in Wisconsin. They established a lot of firsts, which we'll talk about later. But the real year was 1961. And there's a number of reasons why this mention of gay bars is important. But in 1961, an event happened in Milwaukee that kind of vanished from radar. I mean, it kind of became a drinking story. It kind of became folklore by the people who were involved. And over the years, as those people have passed on, this story was known by less and less people. The History Project caught wind of it when it was mentioned in an oral interview in 2011. And when we were researching for the book in 2015, we actually pieced together newspaper clippings, the oral interviews, other articles that have been written, and actually the memoirs of some of the earliest gay rights activists in Wisconsin, all tracing back to the news stories that followed this situation. So with all that being said, the historical significance of this can't be understated. So what happened? Let's get into that. The top picture here is almost unrecognizable. This photo is from the Milwaukee Public Library's Humanities collection. And when I first saw it, I could not figure out what I was even looking at. The reason why is that for almost 60 years, nothing in this picture, except for this, existed. This is the Empire Building, and we're looking north on Plankington Avenue from St. Paul. And this bar here on the right-hand side, this little tiny bar, had been something called the Old Mill Inn from Prohibition to about 1959. In 1959, it was a short-lived bar called Mary's, which we'll talk about later. And then in 1960, it became a bar called the Black Knight. And the Black Knight was significant because it was one of the first bars that was actually designed from day one and actually financed to be a gay bar. By 1960, it was apparent that there was a large appetite for places to go for gay people. But at the time, it was technically illegal for bartenders to serve them and to allow them to congregate. If you had two men sitting on bar stools next to each other, they could not turn and face each other because they could be thrown out of the bar for commiserating, as it was called. And this was, in some cases, considered disorderly conduct because it may lead to them having relations. This is how paranoid bar owners had to be. They had to watch the behaviors of all their patrons and scrutinize them carefully. So imagine what it felt like to be a gay person trying to pass for straight in a straight bar and just being watched the entire time you were there. And if the bartender knew that you were gay, They would accept your money, but they probably wouldn't make you a very good drink, and they probably wouldn't be in a huge hurry to serve you. And most importantly, they wouldn't really treat you very nice. So understanding that, a wealthy financier from Fox Point started investing in gay bars. And the first was Mary's in 1959. Mary herself was brought up from Omaha to run it. She had all kinds of ethical and moral issues with running a gay bar, so she left after a year. And in 1960, it became the Black Knight. And the Black Knight was run by Wally Wetham, who had been a Kohl's food store butcher. Wally had quite an interesting life. By the time that the Black Knight opened, he was on his third of 5 wives, which is kind of incredible. He had a daughter that was in New York State, but for the most part appeared to be kind of a family man on the surface. But again, the Black Knight was a place that was designed for gay people. So the idea that, it was a safe space, it was a place that you could go and they would treat you well and they would welcome you, and you didn't have to worry about getting beat up going there. I mean, it was a safe haven for a lot of people, more than we'll ever know, because at this time in history, gay people couldn't self-identify because they would lose their jobs, they would lose their apartments or homes, they would lose their families, they'd lose their reputation, and most likely none of that would ever be reversible again. So there were a tremendous number of suicides and other short-lived self-destructive lives because of all these harassments. So on the evening of August 5th, 1961, this bar is just getting started for the night. It was apparently a very humid night, kind of foggy, one of those August nights where it's kind of just sticky and gross outside, but somehow foggy because the air is warmer than the lake. And 4 sailors who had been on Keene Place at a tavern drinking lost a drinking bet and had to go to the Black Knight to fulfill a dare. The dare was that they wouldn't go to a gay bar, and they were forced to go. So to save face, they went down to the Black Knight. They tried to get in, but what they didn't realize is that gay bars at that time made you show ID and sign a sheet saying that you wouldn't cause any trouble. So when they refused to do this because they didn't want anyone to know they'd been there, the bouncer said, well, then you're going to have to leave. And they were like, no, we can't leave. We have to be here. You can't tell us what to do. And all 4 sailors decided they were going to beat up the bouncer, which is the dumbest thing they ever did in their entire lives. So, as I said, it was early in the night, so there was really no one there except for the bartender, the bouncer, and one patron who was, as she put it, sitting at the bar in her bathrobe, putting on her face for the night. She heard what was happening, and she said, in that moment, I just grabbed 2 beer bottles and went straight outside because her boyfriend, the bouncer, was in danger. She knocked one of the sailors over the head with a beer bottle and sent him into a concussion that sent him to the hospital. And she scared off the other sailors, but as they were driving away, totally embarrassed that they'd been beaten up by a homosexual, they yelled that they were coming back and they were going to bring people and teach these people a lesson and clean up the bar. So when Josie brings her boyfriend back inside, the owner says, we're going to have to get out of here. We're going to have to lock up this place because God knows what they're going to do. They're going to come back here with guns. They're going to come back here with gangs. This is it. And Josie's response was just, no, we're not running. We're not running from this fight. We're not running from anything. As people started showing up for the night, she was really winding them up and riling them up with the story of how she, beat up these sailors. Josie herself was a gender non-conforming African-American woman. So genetically, she had been born as a man. She had spent time in the Navy. She had traveled the world. She worked in an industrial job that she held for her entire life, and she even fathered a son. But she was not putting up with her space being disrespected. And the spirit she had really infected the crowd that night. These people couldn't go anywhere without being harassed. They couldn't go anywhere without watching over their shoulder for violence. And now that violence was coming to their space. The sailors returned later that night, but they expected to find an empty bar. And when they swung the door open and yelled out, and I quote, "Come on, you sick faggots, let's do this," there were 80 people in the bar ready to fight them. So not their best moment. But the question is really like, why were they so wound up, and why was this like the breaking point? And the answer is that, there had been so much police entrapment and so much crackdown. The past couple months before this had just been so bad for gay people in Milwaukee. A judge had declared a war on perversion and was patrolling city parks and department store bathrooms and movie theater bathrooms and literally alleyways, trying to find gay people to arrest, and would arrest people even if they, if they could build a case that they were somehow gay, they would build it and arrest them. And along the way, hassle them and beat them up, in some cases, very seriously. But the one thing that stuck out in everyone's mind in 1961 was what had happened to Elroy Schultz, who was a fairly well-known member of the gay community. He was 53 years old and had been around for a while. He worked in a brewery. He had an ex-wife and kind of a history of running into the law. He'd been arrested a couple times for disorderly conduct. So he really had some strikes against him. But on April 14th in 1960, he was arrested in Juneau Park, and the police detective said that Elroy had grabbed him and made a proposition. And this just seems really unlikely. He was booked on charges of disorderly conduct, which really was a cover story. It was kind of code for what they called sexual perversion, which we would now just call gay, which is a sad translation. They also claimed he resisted arrest, and this too was a cover story. When he tried to escape, they punched him only once, and somehow he died from this one punch. But the coroners found all kinds of things, ranging from fractured ribs to internal bleeding. He had lost half his teeth. I mean, this was a terrible case of police brutality. And when the medical examiners and police authorities reviewed the case, they said it was justifiable. And the reason it was justifiable is he was a known convict and he was a sexual pervert, and it didn't really matter that he'd been killed because society had been improved by his removal. So this sent a bit of a shockwave through the community, and really people started thinking, now they're killing us. Like, it's not enough for us to be told that we're immoral and that we're sinful and that we're diseased and that we're broken and we're damaged and all of these other horrible things they were told. Now they were being murdered. And, this was really the point of no return. I mean, people suddenly realized we have nothing left to lose. So this was not just a bar brawl. I mean, yes, Milwaukee's been a tavern town since it was founded, but make no mistake, this was not your average bar brawl. The sailors had come here because it was a gay bar, and they'd been dared to go there to humiliate them. When they were asked to sign in, show ID, they refused to do so because it was a gay bar. And they were beat up by someone who was gay, and they wanted to come back and beat that person up in revenge for being gay. So it was all very, very specifically homophobic, and the homophobic violence plays so much into this story. By the time the police arrived later, after this fight had broke out, the bar was completely totaled. Multiple people were sent to the hospital. The reporters were already there. Interesting enough, the police arrested the sailors, but no charges at all were filed against anyone else. And this is really kind of shocking, because you can imagine the number one fear of these patrons was, if I'm found in a gay bar, that's it. Like, I'll lose my job, I'll lose everything. But at that point in time, they had nothing left to lose, and they didn't care. Eventually, the county judge cleared the sailors of all charges after a long, drawn-out process with lots of update articles talking about, this and that, but ultimately they just cleared them of charges. The owner of the bar and the bouncer were kind of bullied by the detectives. Not really sure why, because it was kind of crystal clear what happened, and you had 80 witnesses. But the bar was forced to close as a disorderly house. Basically, they just said, you're not capable of running a bar, so you have to close, which really doesn't make a lot of sense since it was technically an invasion of the property. But what really happened here so it was sad, right? I mean, the community lost this refuge, this little tiny space in this old rundown building, this one place they could call their own. But what happened next was kind of incredible. So newspapers really wanted to scandalize this. They really wanted to make it seem like, oh my God, there's gay people here in Milwaukee. Can you imagine? We've heard about them existing in San Francisco. We've heard about them existing in New York, but they're here and they're violent and they're dangerous. They have their own spaces in our city. And I mean, there was just this gay panic that burst out. But it kind of backfired because the words gay bar appeared in print for the first time, or in some fashion. I can't remember the exact, how it was exactly phrased, but technically the words gay bar appeared, and people who had been told their entire lives, an entire generation of people, that they were the only gay person in the world, they were the only one who felt this way, they were the only ones who had this problem, and they needed to, straighten up, man up, clean up, whatever. Even if it took electroshock therapy, even if it took medication, even if it took psychiatric care, they had to conform with the standards. Suddenly realized that that was a lie, and that they had a community here in their hometown, and that there were other people like them. And this was a bit of a magical moment in Milwaukee. But all of this was hidden by history. I mean, all of this was just this wasn't documented. This wasn't taught in schools. This wasn't taught from parents to children, or even from, gay uncles to gay nephews. And it's because the people who were involved eventually just faded away. Josie would tell this story at cocktail parties, and people would be like, oh, well, is that really what happened? Is this just a tall tale, or what do we believe? And, at the time, there really was no gay media, at all, at least not for another 10 years. So the story just kind of faded away, and this uprising, although documented, and a lot of early LGBTQ uprisings were not. If you've done any reading about the Cooper's Donut incident of 1959 in Los Angeles, or the Compton Cafeteria riot of August 1966, these things were not documented. They were just vague memories in the survivors' minds until someone sat down with them and said, what was it like when you were growing up? What was it like when you first moved to this city? And they talked about these things, and people are like, where's the evidence that this ever happened? There was no evidence, because as you see here, no one wanted it recorded. If you have a heritage, if you have a culture, if you have a history, you have a community. And there were very active efforts to prevent people from organizing, very active efforts to keep people from behaving a certain way, and very active efforts from people non-conforming. So when you search for LGBT history prior to probably the 90s, this is what you get. You get a whole lot of static. And if you know the negative code words of the time, this is what you get. You get all kinds of stuff. If you start looking for vice, if you start looking for perversion, morals charges, sexual deviant, that was my favorite. That was used a lot in the 1950s and 60s in Milwaukee. People were sexual deviants, and it was never said like what they did or how they were determined to be a deviant. But it's kind of like with this wink of, oh, the fact that 24 policemen were patrolling Juneau Park at one point every night, how and why was that ever necessary? People were arrested in huge droves in like these busts at places, and who knows if they were even doing anything wrong or if they just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. My favorite is this one, the 5,000 to 6,000 homosexuals here. It's like, how in the world did they know that? But all this sensationalism, all this gay panic really drove people nuts, because on one side you had people who were acting as if gay people had just started existing, and on the other hand you had a community of people who knew that they had existed for a very long time. So I think that one of the key talking points I have for you today is that LGBTQ history did not start at Stonewall. Stonewall was a culmination. It was kind of a explosion. It was kind of an ending of an old time and kind of a start of a new time. But a lot of things started a lot earlier, and they were happening. And the core message is that LGBT people have always been here, whether they were recognized, whether they were acknowledged, whether they were legal or not. Some of the landmarks you see here are some of the very first places in Milwaukee where LGBT people were recorded. In 1926, the Antlers Hotel opened on 2nd between Wisconsin and Michigan. It opened as a men-only hotel by design. I'm not really sure about this ad that says bring the ladies, since ladies weren't allowed to stay there. I'm not sure if that was some kind of like cover story of sorts. But the Antlers was fantastic. It had 150 rooms. It had everything a confirmed bachelor would want, including a very popular coffee shop on the ground floor and a bar where, until the 70s, gay men were still meeting. So pretty shocking that in 1926 there was like a hotel built, giving people the option who maybe didn't want a family, didn't want the suburbs, didn't want the American dream. They wanted to live downtown. They wanted to live a male-only life. The Antlers gave men that option for generations. The Antlers was torn down to build Grand Avenue in 1979, and it was considered a severe flop house by then. But part of that judgment was based in the fact that it had appeared in gay guides, national gay guides, telling people where to go in America's cities since 1963. In 1928, one of the first recorded mentions of gay people in Milwaukee appears in an FBI report of agents who raided the St. Charles Hotel, which you see here. This is City Hall Square. This is approximately the location of the new M&I Tower. The St. Charles Hotel was a really old hotel. It spent a while being owned by the Pabst family. And by 1928, it was kind of out of control. The owner was very lenient with the liquor laws, also very lenient with the morals. Federal agents recorded that, using language of the time, that pansy boys and dagger dykes can be found here almost every night, and that liquor flowed so freely that all you had to do is lift up a phone receiver and ask for it. The St. Charles Hotel was padlocked for a year during Prohibition. Everyone who moved out actually moved back in a year later to the day. It closed in the early 30s due to there was all kinds of strange paranormal activity reported, which was kind of odd, and as well as the bankruptcy of the hotel operator. The hotel was torn down shortly thereafterward, but what was curious about this is that lenient, relaxed, laid-back hotel manager, Joseph Boudar, moved across town to 5th and Michigan and ran the Royal Hotel, which we'll get to shortly. The Royal Hotel, by 1935, was a documented gathering place for gay and lesbian people in Milwaukee, which is really quite shocking. Down here, you have a house that looks like nothing. It's in the end states of its life. But this was really a very important house in Milwaukee's history, and not just its LGBTQ history. This house appeared in sporting guides of Milwaukee in the 19-teens and even the first decade of the 20th century as the Kitty Williams house. So this was somehow a 42-room bordello at one point that was so opulent and so majestic and so pretentious that it was almost otherworldly. It sat on the corner of State and Water, approximately where Red Arrow Park is now. After the River Street cleanup and Kitty's bordello being closed, she ran a bar out of the ground floor. You can kind of see it here. And she kind of became a bit of a fairy godmother figure to young wayward men who, if they had nowhere to live and nowhere to work, they could work in her bar and live in her bordello, which is kind of strange. Kitty lost her liquor license reportedly for serving beer on Election Day, but she had a long history by then of people being arrested for disorderly conduct and for just very nebulous things. And at the time, it probably just seemed, oh, well, they're trying to find a reason to shut her down. So serving beer on election day, sure, let's go with that. A couple years later, someone tried to reopen the bar, and the reports, the Common Council pulled their license in April of 1942. The Common Council pulled their license and said, much like Kitty Williams herself, this operator was allowing unsavory characters to gather here and people of questionable morals and just all of these code words that basically say gay for 1940s. In fact, the stigma of Kitty and her successor were so bad that a third operator tried to open in June of 1942, and he too was denied because he was the brother-in-law of the second operator, and it was implied that the two were in more than a business relationship. So Kitty's house started as, a pleasure zone for traveling businessmen and wound up being a bit of a gay youth hostel in its later years. She died in 1943. Her house kind of crumbled away over the course of 20 years and was demolished in 1963 for City Hall parking. The Red Room is notorious as being the starting place for Liberace. It was in the basement of the Plankinton Arcade from the late 30s to 1960 when it went bankrupt and they closed all of the businesses in the basement. There was the Red Room side, which was this fabulous mid-century bar, and there was the Green Room side, which was this kind of dull-looking cafeteria. Would it be really fun today to sit at this Red Room bar and listen to a piano player and have some fancy drinks? One of the contributors to the History Project said the real reason they closed the Red Room bar is because for years people were being arrested in their bathrooms for having relations. And their way of doing this was standing in shopping bags from the department stores so that no one would detect there was more than one person in the bathroom stall. Eventually, they hired a bathroom attendant, and they actually even charged money to get into the bathrooms, which was kind of unheard of. It was a whole nickel, but it stopped no one. I mean, this was apparently just the way things were done back then. But kind of a secret history of the Red Room and its reputation. Again, here is the Royal Hotel mentioned earlier. This was on 5th in Michigan. We're looking south on 5th. Michigan is running horizontal to us here. It was a repainting in sometime in the late 40s. The Royal Hotel was opened in 1928. It was really supposed to be the crown jewel of a chain of hotels for a man named Royal Nixdorf. The minute this hotel opened, all of his luck went south. He had all kinds of problems, ranging from bankruptcy to his wife's suicide, his daughter suing him for alienation, whatever that meant. And eventually he died an early death in the penthouse of the hotel. The hotel was changing hands like almost every year for a while, but it really became a place of counterculture value and almost underground value. I mean, it was a strange place. In fact, when the Wizard of Oz midgets, or Lollipop Guild, toured Milwaukee in some type of organized tour, they all stayed here. And someone writing an article for the Milwaukee Journal said, well, of course they would stay at the Royal Hotel. Where else would they stay? I mean, it was just implied that this was a very strange place for very strange people. And because of that, the LGBT community really gravitated towards it. It was an odd place, but it was their place. And the ground floor bar and coffee shop really appealed to them. And for a long time, the owner would actually bail out people who were arrested, whether it was at the hotel or otherwise, or harassed by police for being gay or lesbian. By the 1950s, this becomes a center of all sorts of disorderly conduct arrests. It appears to have been word on the street, especially among sailors from the Great Lakes Naval Base, that this was a place for easy sex. The fact that it was with other men seemed to have escaped them. But there were lots and lots of arrests, lots of lives ruined, because when people were arrested, their names were printed in the paper, their age, their address, and their profession as well. And the Royal Hotel ruined a whole lot of reputations before it was torn down in 1973 for the Blue Cross Blue Shield complex. Today, this is the parking lot of the Buckler apartment buildings on 4th in Michigan, which are in the former Blue Cross Tower. Another property that was early known and one of our earliest and oldest contributors to the History Project shared with us is in this picture. And this is a really cool picture because you have a vintage white tower that's still standing, which is just amazing, just beautiful. I wish Milwaukee still had these today. But this is the corner of 6th and Wells. Wisconsin Avenue is in the far distance, and they're still building, it appears, the Mariner Tower. Nonetheless, there used to be a bar right around here next to the chicken restaurant that was a Hellenic post and of the American Legion. And it was run by the Marmigas family. And apparently the deal was they would allow gay men to meet as long as it was in the back room on the other side of the jukebox and they didn't cause any trouble. And one of our earliest contributors by the name of Bunny, who passed away last November, remembers being 15 years old and going to this bar and just being amazed that there were men like himself gathering in this place and kind of in this like hidden dark back room, kind of like they could only exist in the shadows. And that, you know, made him both sad and terrified that this was his future. The Marmigas family kind of disappeared from Milwaukee in 1949. One of the bartenders from this bar eventually moved over to another bar, which I'll show you in a moment. And the connections between all of these different places are just so myriad and so hidden, but at the same time, so obvious. That other bar that he moved over to may be familiar to many people. 4 generations, the words gay bar in Milwaukee meant the Mint Bar, which was on 4th and State. In a ever-growing sea of parking. There was not much left around it. This building was gone. A building that used to be around the Mint Bar was gone. I guess if you're going to open a gay bar in 1949 and you're going to operate within walking distance from City Hall, walking distance from the courthouse, the police station, etc., you better be buried in billboards because otherwise you might be a little too obvious. What's curious about the Mint Bar is, again, one of the bartenders from the Legion Bar, as it was known, came over here and opened it, worked here until he died in 1978, and his wife carried it forward for almost another decade. But what's curious is that unlike any other gay bars of the time, or even of like my lifetime, the Mint Bar always had windows. You could walk right by here and you could look right in and see who was in there. And I think it was something like 12 by 20 feet. I mean, this was a tiny little building. It only had 12 bar stools. It had, I believe, 2 tables. I don't know that it would even pass zoning laws today, but for some reason it's survived until 1988 when it was torn down for the Bradley Center parking, which in turn has again been torn down. So there's no trace of the Mint Bar, there's no trace of the Bradley Center, and this whole heritage was lost. As I said, the Aiellos, married couple, ran this as kind of a mom and pop shop, and it was very definitely a gay bar for a very, very long time. They had their regulars. Over time, their regulars aged. The Mint Bar didn't really keep up with the times and eventually kind of fell out of fashion. But it did move. They were given a ton of money for the property, which was probably far more than it was worth. They moved the bar to Walker's Point, and when Betty died, that was pretty much it for the Mint Bar. At the time that it closed, it was the longest operating LGBT business in Wisconsin and the longest running gay bar in Milwaukee at almost 40 years old. Another place that was also very famous in the early days was the Hotel Belmont, another place that was kind of populated by strange people in a strange vibe. But again, very much embraced by the gay community. By 1950s, this restaurant on the ground floor, which was about a block long, it was a diner with like windows all the way around, started being open 24 hours. So this was really strange in downtown Milwaukee at the time. It really became a hot spot. People really loved it. They would go there after shows. They'd go there before work. They'd go there, after the bars closed. And it really became a mishmash, a melting pot of all different kinds of people, including the residents from upstairs. One of our contributors, Bunny, said the place was so weird and just so out of control at bar time that I walked in nude with my mink stole dragging behind me and no one even batted an eye. There was so much going on in this place and so much to look at that no one even noticed me. And I think that Milwaukee could use a little bit of that kind of weirdness. in our modern day. So moving on, by 1949, the south side of downtown looked like this. This is another picture that's probably unrecognizable to people because none of these landmarks are still there. Well, actually, one of them is. So this is the Pritzloff Hardware Building. And as you can see, it was once part of a complex of many buildings. It was very close to the Milwaukee Road train station. Here's the park, here's the train station, here's the public service building, which at that time had the Greyhound station in it. So this was really a huge hub of commerce downtown. And just a few blocks away, if you knew where you were going, you would find Milwaukee's first gay neighborhood. So the 400 block of North Plankington, which is now under a freeway, was a whole bunch of old Cream City brick buildings, all predated the Civil War, all were just massive and imposing and coal-stained. As you can see here, the Goodrich steamer, which was a ferry that went to Chicago, the terminal is still standing. So like the boat used to come through here. And this had to have been close to abandoned at this point. You can also see that the Buffalo Street Bridge is still standing, which really doesn't make a whole lot of sense for the street grid. This was abandoned and replaced by the St. Paul Bridge, which we'll talk about in a moment. But nonetheless, this whole area south of downtown after World War II was really in the way. It was in the way of progress. It was in the way of renewal. It was in the way of a 1948 master plan for downtown that really hammered a freeway through here early in the city planning. And because of that, both here and on the north side of downtown, where a similar thing was underway, the landlords of these buildings, the property owners, just kind of watched and waited. They didn't put a lot of money into the buildings. They didn't clean them up. They didn't paint them. They didn't replace broken glass. And this area, this like odd connection point between the 3rd Ward downtown and Walker's Point, or the 5th Ward, just kind of got lost. It was described to me as kind of like a place you drove through to go other places, but you never went anywhere in here. This was just like this dark, murky Raymond Chandler kind of place. There weren't even street lights. Sometimes they didn't shovel the sidewalks when it snowed. I mean, it was just kind of this lost and lonely part of town. And for that reason, people who couldn't get bar licenses anywhere else started getting bar licenses in here. This building here on Clybourne and Plankington had been the Clybourne Tavern for generations. And in 1948, it opened as the Fox Bar, which was an early gay bar. Kind of a long, narrow, skinny tunnel of a bar that you step down into. And it really was nothing, there was really nothing famous or fabulous about it. It was just that it was kind of cavernous. In the 50s, they tried to modernize it by selling off an oak mahogany bar, an original hand-carved bar, at something like $1.25 a foot. I mean, it was just this travesty. This huge building over here became Tony's Riviera, which we'll talk about in a second. And then over here was the Black Knight building. So as you can see, you have 3 gay bars on one block by 1960. And it's all walkable. It's all within the short distance from the train, the bus, the city bus. And right across the river was the Cross Keys Hotel, for future home of the River Queen, but at this point, a home for the Crystal Palace, which was kind of a predecessor of maybe Organ Piper Pizza. It was the kind of place where you went and just kind of like sang along at a piano and threw peanuts on the floor, which was very popular with gay men of the time. So here's Tony's Riviera. Tony's Riviera opened in 1949. It tried to really be an upstanding supper club. In 1953, Tony Maki took over, and Tony Maki turned it into more of a cocktail lounge and less of a place you would go eat. Bunny described it as a place the police hung out with their women, but never with their wives. And in 1964, the bar suffered a tragedy that kind of doomed this neighborhood. This was an old seed building, as you can see. It was an old warehouse, and when Hunkle Seed moved out, they didn't take all their seeds with them. So up in these upper floors for years were all of these old dried out seeds just waiting to ignite in flame, which is what happened one night when a married man broke up with his male lover in the bar. He went out back, bought a whole bunch of gasoline and poured it all over the backside of the building where there was an old seed elevator still standing. And this building went up in a 6-alarm fire that burned for days. When the police showed up, the bartender was still cleaning glassware, even though the ceiling was on fire. And when they asked the man, what are you doing? Get out of here. Like, you're in danger. He said, well, you don't leave a dirty bar no matter what you do. Mr. Maki doesn't like it that way. So it was pretty interesting story. The building burned to the ground. It was never rebuilt. It supposedly reopened on 3rd and Plankington. We have never found evidence that really happened. But the family eventually moved the bar way over to the east side where it became Teddy's and eventually today's Shank Hall. Here's the Black Knight, which started as the Old Mill Inn, later became Mary's, and then, of course, the Black Knight. After the riot of 1961, they were ordered to close. A new owner was licensed, and then they opened back up as Bourbon Beat, which I believe it is here at this time. Bourbon Beat stayed open until 1966 when it was torn down, supposedly for the extension of St. Paul Avenue. But, I mean, if you go there now, this land is still empty. 55 years later, there is really no reason to tear this building down. It was more work to tear it down than to renovate it. I believe this building in the middle was preserved and still standing into the 90s, because if you remember getting off the freeway at the Plankington Avenue exit, there was just this one weird little old building still standing there, like a ghost of this whole neighborhood. And here's the Fox Bar, which I mentioned earlier, which was on the far corner, way down this block. This is where the Cambria Hotel is now, the brand new hotel. So that footprint is kind of finally filled back in. At the time, it was Frankfurt Hardware. These are some of the places all over town that were available to people in the 50s. I will go over them very quickly because I know we're short on time. The first was the Park Hotel. This was right by the Milwaukee Road Depot. It had a circular bar in its center, and people would send notes from the bartender across to other people. The Park Hotel also was a place that would rent rooms to gay men. So it was a starting point in the city for many. Below it here is the Gay 90s. So with a name like that, I mean, obvious gay bar, right? Wrong. And the Gay 90s started in 1945. It was a bit of a 1890s revival bar. They did things like can shows. They did like karaoke. They, just like all kinds of zany things. And it later moved to Plankington Avenue, where it was in the building that eventually became Nino's Steakhouse. It got kicked out of there, and then it moved over here to finish out its life from the 50s to the mid-60s. In the middle of this bar, underneath all these makeshift weird add-ons, which I don't know how this ever passed building codes, was an old tavern from like the 1870s. And when Barron's Gay 90s moved in here, Baron Siegel, who was a vaudeville legend in Milwaukee, bought out this old tavern, which had its original bar from the 1860s. And unfortunately, they really didn't maintain this property. As you can see, it's already falling down at this point. So the city tried to shut them down several times, and after a wall literally just collapsed while the business was open, they were ordered to close because it was uninhabitable for human life. And they didn't even allow them time to excavate or pull anything out of there. So that original bar and all the furnishings were lost. This became a parking lot for the Royal Hotel. This space right here, for those who remember Sally's Steakhouse, this was its original location, which also went up in flames, curiously, before she moved to the Knickerbocker Hotel. Prior to being Sally's Steakhouse, it was called Mr. Anthony's Cocktail Lounge, which was kind of an at random of its time. Next to the Belmont Hotel was a place called the Gay Time. This is another funny story. The owner was called into the Common Council for a license renewal, and they told him, your name implies too gay of a time. And at the time, the name of the bar was Sally's. And he was like, what do you mean? And he's like, well, don't you know what Sally's means? And at the time, it was a word for an effeminate man, or, a slur for a homosexual. So he's like, well, what do you want me to call my bar then? I'll take your suggestions. And so one of them came up with the word gay time. You can have a gay time at the Gay Time bar. And the Common Council agreed and let them rename it this. And he was like, okay. I don't think it changed any of their clientele. Unfortunately, the building was torn down, and the gay time and this amazing sign were torn down with it for parking for the Belmont. The White Horse is an interesting story. So the oldest gay bar in the country right now is the White Horse in Oakland, and it appears that the words White Horse were kind of code in mid-century for a gay bar. The White Horse was in the Six Corners neighborhood, which has not existed in 60 years, which was where Valete, Winnebago, 11th, 12th, Central, and one more, blanking, where all of those streets met over in what is now the middle of the interchange, just north of the courthouse. So the interesting thing about the White Horse is it was built by a man named Hans Huber in 1905, and Hans Huber was from Bavaria, and he was very pro-Bavaria. So he built like a bit of a lodge and a halfway house of sorts for people who are moving from Germany, didn't know English, wanted to acclimate to American society, wanted a place to live where everyone spoke German, and the whole neighborhood at that point did. In fact, 11th Street was known as Bavarian Avenue for a long time because of all the German people who lived there. After Hans Huber died, the family sold the business, and after World War II, it became a gay bar. And what's most noteworthy about the White Horse is that it was a known hangout of Senator Joseph McCarthy, who at the time was persecuting people for being homosexual. At the same time, he was hanging out in Milwaukee's #1 gay bar of the time. So kind of a hypocrite. A couple of other places of this era, the Grand Prix opened on Juneau Avenue. This is where Arts Performing Center is now. The Grand Prix was, it kind of looks like it might be like a race car themed bar. It had art from Al Hirschfield inside. It was just a little corner tavern, but at the time, Water Street was so rough and so run down in the early 60s that this bar appeared in gay guides. And every time it appeared, it had a caution that pickpockets and thieves roam the streets in this neighborhood, which is so strange to think about now that Juneau and Water would be this rough neighborhood. We did not know until recently that the Roche family had a hand in opening this. So this actually raises some questions that we need to get back to and some research that needs to be done. Later on, the bar was owned by a completely different person, and before it passed into new hands in 1971. Two places that are really interesting. One is the Night Beat. This is the first women's bar in Milwaukee. It opened in 1959 on 9th and National. The bar is still there. The building is still standing, and it kind of looks like it might have in 1959. The Night Beat eventually moved to 2nd and Pittsburgh. It stayed on one side of the street for a long time and then moved to the other side of the street. And then the partners who ran it, who were an unmarried male and female couple, kind of broke up. It was renamed Carrie's, and then it was completely destroyed in flame in 1974, which brought an end to the Night Beat era. The Pink Pony is a name that a lot of people of a certain generation remember. It was on 19th and North. It was, again, kind of an at-random kind of bar, kind of a Brian's kind of place. They said souvenirs for the ladies, but it was really more of a men's bar. It was a place to kind of start or end your night. It somehow stayed open until the mid-70s. I can't imagine it was still as upscale. By that point, the original owner had already left the business, had already died, actually. And after a number of different arson-related fires, the Pink Pony finally closed in 1975. The Diplomat was on 7th and Juneau. This building is long gone. It was originally a Pabst Tide House beer bar. No surprise, being right outside of the Pabst Brewery. The Diplomat was an early example of money coming into Milwaukee from outside of town to set up a gay bar and then hire people to kind of socialize the gay bar with the local community and make it popular. For these reasons, there were a lot of questions about who really owned it, who really ran it. I don't know if they were looking for organized crime. I don't know if they were looking for, a convicted homosexual, which means that he couldn't have a license for a bar. But the Diplomat only lasted about a year, even though it was apparently very beautiful. We have been unable to find any pictures of it at all. It was done up kind of like a Mardi Gras theme and just sounds like it was a fantastic mid-century Art Deco space, and it just didn't exist long enough to be photographed. Finally, the Bridgeport. This is a good example of, in 1963, if you're going to move your gay bar from one part of town to the other, what do you do to tell people? You put a personals ad in the paper that's so vague that you don't even know what it really means. We've been trying to find pictures of the Bridgeport, people who've been to the Bridgeport. The only reason we know the Bridgeport exists is it's listed in gay guides throughout the early 60s, but only at this address. We don't know where it was before. We have been unable to find out who owned it, why they opened it. It's one of our hidden history challenges at the moment. And then last but not least, the two on this side, very recognizable building. Most recently, this was Trocadero. It was the Knott's Bar for a long time. It was a Gettleman Tavern, obviously, as you can see here, although there's a Blatt sign as well. This was known as Regency East in the early 60s, and Regency East was trying to be elegant. It had ferns and chandeliers and like those weird wax drippy lamps and all kinds of things that tried to make it seem like it was upscale, but it had a bit of a reputation for being kind of like a rundown gay bar, but people still went there because it was close to Brady Street and it was on its way, from one place to the next. Eventually, the bar was kind of pressured out of existence by the Balistreri crime family. They wanted this property to open a bar for one of their capos, and that's what happened. So the Regency East was forced out of business. They were given another building on North Avenue, which became known as 1000 East, and they closed the Regency East and moved up there. One of the most important ones that I want to share with you today is the TikTok Club. So this opened in the 1940s, and it was the first air-conditioned bar in Milwaukee, which was like quite a selling point. But it was also the home of some really remarkable traveling drag shows throughout the late 40s and early 50s. There was a bit of a drag renaissance after the 1930s ban that many cities, not Milwaukee, but Chicago and other cities, literally banned drag shows. They literally banned cross-dressing. It was against the law. But in the 50s, the Jewel Box Revue, which was like this 24-person cabaret troupe that traveled the country and went all over the world, actually, with female impersonators who called themselves Mr., even though they were in drag, because they wanted to be abundantly clear. They weren't trying to deceive anyone. They weren't trying to break the law. And this was at a time where people still thought that if you were a cross-dresser, if you were a drag queen, you were up to crime. You were going to do something. That's why you were dressing in a disguise. It's because you were going to do crimes. The Jewel Box Revue is a really fascinating story. I cannot believe no one's done a book or a documentary on it. They'll be featured in ours, but their story alone is just incredible. They were run by a gay couple who traveled the country with their mothers. This whole troop of people always traveled in buses or cars that they themselves drove. They never flew anywhere. I mean, it was just crazy. But what's really interesting is that the TikTok was a place in the 1950s that people went, like suburban people would come downtown. My grandparents came downtown to hang out at the TikTok and see drag shows, which is not something you think there would be any tolerance for. And certainly we nowadays believe before Stonewall that things like that just didn't exist. Well, they certainly did. A couple of other quick locations that have vanished from the map. This is actually right around the place that they're building the new hotel in the Deer District. This is Annadell's Diner, and next door to Annadell's Diner, which was a famous 24-hour late-night place, this was the Clifton Hotel, which was built before the Civil War. And next door was a bar called the Clifton Tap. The Clifton Tap was a gay bar as early as 1935 and operated until it was destroyed destroyed by the Expressway Commission, along with everything else you see here. The Clifton Tap had like huge, like Woolworth-style rounded windows that you could see in. But the back bar, which had kind of pocket doors and secret rooms and stuff, is where the gay bar was. It was kind of like a separate bar within a bar, kind of a safe house kind of thing. A block away, but a block diagonally, was this block. This is in the old Central Market / Haymarket district. This is 5th and McKinley. And this little tiny bar here, that you can see the beer sign, but not really read it, next door to the former Ace Hardware that used to be here, which now is being renovated for other purposes that escape me. But anyway, this little tiny bar, and this is the only picture we've ever found of it, opened in 1961 as a gay bar called Castaways. And Castaways was famous throughout the Midwest because they allowed men to dance together. And this was like strictly forbidden, even in Milwaukee, but they did it. And people drove from Chicago in caravans to go dancing in the 60s at Castaways. This whole area was torn down for the Park East Freeway, much like the picture above it. Castaways moved to 2nd in Pittsburgh and joined that collection of gay bars that replaced the Plankington Strip. And this really, didn't last real long down there. Its heyday was kind of behind it. But Castaways really made a name for Milwaukee as a gay rights state 20 years before legislation did. Over here is the only known picture of the Pink Glove. The Pink Glove was on Milwaukee Street between Wisconsin and Michigan. This is now, I think, a Hilton Garden hotel. And this is the Railway Exchange Building. And this bar was opened by a pair of Jewish brothers from Milwaukee who are just honest businessmen, just wanted to make money. And they're like, hey, let's open a place for gay people. That no one else wants to serve them, we'll serve them. The problem was they were way too successful. They made so much money. I mean, even in those days, the amount of money they made was obscene. And they attracted the attention of Frank Balistrieri, who wanted them to pay him a cut of their money. They refused to do so. Their lives were threatened. There were all kinds of heated meetings and arguments in public places. And then the bar started getting raided by Balistrieri's goons, who would come and rob the till. The Common Council was against them because they were serving gay people and weren't ashamed of it. For 1958, this was not a good business model. And then they were gone. And then the Klein brothers, who opened it, never opened another bar again. So it was kind of a sad story because they were really trying to do something way ahead of their time. If they'd done it 10 years later, they would have been rich and famous. Last but not least, this is the old Ambrosia House on Mason and Jefferson. This was outside of the Pfister Hotel, across the street from the Leighton Art Gallery. This was a little stone cottage. It looked like it had been built in colonial times. It wasn't that old. It was built to look old. But when you walked in, it kind of had this vibe of old Americana. It had a fireplace. It had an oak bar. It had oak rafters. It was just this little tiny cottage, but a very famous bar of its time from 1959 to 1971. It sat on that corner and, was a gathering place for businessmen after work and certainly tourists from the Pfister Hotel. But the unfortunate thing is that the land was more valuable than the business. So the Seaway Inn, which was the gay bar that sat here, was forced to relocate. And much like all the other gay bars of the era, when their land was bought out, they moved to Walker's Point because that was where land was cheapest. And there were a lot of abandoned buildings to move into. So the Seaway moved to Walker's Point in 1971. This was torn down, and 50 years later, it is still a blank parking lot with nothing but a bush to show for it. Kind of sad. At the same time that the Seaway was open, the Pfister Hotel was kind of in a weird era. It was before the Marcus family bought it. It was after its kind of legacy owners had owned it. And it was bought by a group from New York that really wanted to modernize it. The Pfister introduced on its ground floor the Columns, which was a Roman-themed kind of tiki bar. They had flaming lava bowls. They had Roman gladiators walking around shirtless. They had people serving drinks in togas. It was really something else. We have been unable to find photos of this anywhere. We feel that maybe the Marcus Corporation doesn't want photos to be found. We would love to find photos of the Columns because it just sounds so insane. Apparently they had a live volcano in the middle of the bar. It just sounds nuts. But that was torn down and replaced by Cafe Rouge sometime in the mid to late 60s, and the Columns was erased from history. The Columns was very popular with gay men of the time because they basically took all the bodybuilders in town and gave them jobs as gladiator doormen or servers wearing togas. So you can imagine the eye candy in that place. So with all this being said, we're coming up to an apex here so between the Black Night and all of these businesses opening and all of this community gathering happening and all this activation and mobilization and excitement and community coming together for the first time, I mean, it's just exciting. You start seeing things like this in the Milwaukee Journal. So like the Milwaukee Journal posts an editorial, and this is from like their editorial board. This is not like the letter written by some crazy wingnut. This is what the Journal is telling its readers. That, you know, the city has come so far and the homosexuals have kind of like taken over, and they want us to believe that their life is not just acceptable but desirable, and they've gotten so bold that we don't know what to do with them. And a year later, the Sentinel basically says the same thing. So this is the Black Night. The circus parade is rolling past it. So you have these gay bars that are like in town, and they're just part of like the landscape. And like, you know, families are watching the circus parade outside of a gay bar and they don't even know it. So this quote is really ironic because this is not an unfamiliar picture. Like these kind of things are going on all over town. But they're basically saying, you know, how are we going to deal with all these homosexuals? Because, you know, there's more of them, they're more visible, and now they're causing this problem. And it just goes to show that, like, you know, what was once hidden, what was once forbidden, what was once put away, just kind of explodes. And it explodes in all kinds of different directions after 1965. The ad lib opens, which offers female impersonators and strippers. So essentially, if you were a female impersonator or a transsexual, like someone who had actually had gender affirmation surgery in this era, you didn't really have a whole lot of choices for jobs. And one of the most popular jobs for female impersonators who are doing drag by night was to be a stripper by day. So the ad lib, which was run by the Balistreri family, right around 4th and Wells, swapped out their female cast for an all-star cast of female impersonators. It made no sense, but as people who have worked there told us, no one knew the difference. So the gays went there because it was essentially a drag show and it was ridiculous. And, you know, the joke was on the straight people. Jamie Gaze, who is a famous drag performer of this era, was one of the employees and actually auditioned with Frank Balistreri, who he had to give a lap dance to. Which I can't imagine what that was like. But he said, you know, I was taking soldiers' dog tags and putting them in like my privates, and I was doing all these like really dirty things. And if those people knew that I was actually a man, I would never have lived through the night. I would have been dead. So there was a bit of a thrill, but at the same time, a massive amount of danger. The ad lib closed in 1975. It had long before that abandoned its female impersonator trial. There was a famous trial there in the early 70s featuring Misty Dawn, who was genetically a woman who had been born a man. She had had gender surgery. And when the police came to arrest her because she was doing things that a woman wasn't allowed to do in a strip club, she said, well, I was born a man, so what's the difference? So it was like a brilliant defense. And I have to say the Balistreri crime family knew what they were doing here because they avoided a lot of laws that pertain to strip clubs. A couple of other things that start happening in Milwaukee is Vice starts to roll into town. You start to see porn theaters by the late 60s, first showing kind of like nudie, cutie, silly movies, maybe sex education movies or like biology movies. Like I think that one of the first X-rated movies that appeared at the Princess Theater was one about the birth of a baby, which I mean, why you would go to the theater to see that and how that's possibly erotic is beyond me, but I gratefully was not alive in the early 60s. But the Princess really goes downhill and becomes a bit of a Vice place. The Brass Rail next door becomes a bit of a Vice hangout, and downtown starts a bit of a decline. But there's more places for gay people to go. The first bathhouses start opening in Milwaukee. This was Finlandia, which BJ actually worked at, astonishingly, as a cashier. And this was over on Van Buren and Knapp Street. which, I mean, it's kind of unthinkable now as you look at that building, as you go past it. It's like, how was that? But these became very common in Milwaukee. They were just part of like gay liberation, the place that you would go to meet people, a place you would go to socialize and be yourself and be free. They were not part of my experience. They were all closed in Milwaukee in 1988 due to the AIDS crisis and partially due to a tuberculosis breakout, although they have started to make a comeback in America, surprisingly, in the most recent years. But anyway, to summarize everything, by 1969, which is when the Stonewall riots happened, 33 gay bars, of which we've covered only half of them, had already opened in Milwaukee. They were everywhere. There were so many choices. There were so many places for gay people to go all over the whole city. And remember that the next time someone tells you that gay history started at Stonewall. It certainly did not. A couple people that we have to thank from the History Project for our work. The first is Jim Dorn. He turned this kind of ramshackle looking building on First and National into Your Place, which was in 1965, the first gay bar in the Walker's Point neighborhood proper. That is to say, the neighborhood that we now think of as where the gay bars are. So within the area of Second and National, this was the first spot. And I mean, it was there for generations. The Dorn family lived upstairs. He lived with his lover and his parents, very ahead of the time. And his niece remembers having family Christmases on the dance floor, which lit up like Saturday Night Fever. So Your Place is gone now. This is now a strip club and has been for probably 20 years. Another one to remember and a bar that you should visit and support for many, many reasons is June Brem. So a lot of the bars that I just showed you, June went to with her gay friends in the 60s. She was a single mother and had a male business partner. A lot of people didn't like dealing with her because she was a woman and she didn't know business, but she actually knew business pretty damn well. In 1968, after looking at all kinds of places to open a bar, she thought to herself, you know, what kind of bar, what kind of place do I want to open? She'd been working way out in Germantown and Sussex, I believe, and she wanted something downtown. And having been to all these places I just mentioned, you know, she looked around and she's like, God, like, why do they put up with this? Like, a lot of these places have no windows. There's no lighting. They don't have toilets that flush. Some of them don't have ice. The beer is warm. Some of them are like in basements, like tombs. She's like, so, you know, I'm going to create a place for them if I have to open it myself. And that's exactly what she did. So in summer of 1968, she opened This Is It, which is still operating today, 53 years later. This Is It is now the oldest and longest running LGBT business in Wisconsin and one of the top 5 in the whole country. So we strongly encourage you to support it. It made it through the pandemic, which is a miracle. So many bars have closed across America, even here in Los Angeles, where I currently live. Long-running legacy bars with so much history just gone in 1 year. This Is It instead thrived. They actually expanded into the neighboring business and now have a huge theater space that they show performances at. And actually this year, another year without a Pride Fest, they brought in Pride level entertainment in their bar and kept Pride alive for the city, which I thought was just insane, seeing the caliber of talent, but also very, very thoughtful and very, very generous of them. You know, Pride Fest attracts 45,000 people. Obviously, you can't get that many into this bar, but knowing that the city had already lost a Pride event last year due to COVID, they weren't willing to let the city lose again. So they really stepped up and made Pride happen in Milwaukee. June has since passed away. The bar has passed out of the family and into new hands, but I believe it's in very good hands. And I think that This Is It is with us for a long time to come. A couple of other people to thank. So this is Bunny I mentioned earlier. Bunny was everywhere in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. She and her friends would do drag and make cocktails and ride the city buses just to mess with people. She was a bit of a gender terrorist for her time, but she was an invaluable source of knowledge and information that we're still piecing together. In fact, I'm working with the Milwaukee County Historical Society Research Library on a case that was presented to us as a murder mystery from 1967, and Bunny knew about the case and had crystal clear information to share about it in my notes from 2015. So Bunny's kind of the gift that keeps on giving, and the legacy of LGBT Milwaukee that, just can't quit. Bunny passed away in November, and there's so many things that I wish I'd asked, and this is really the plight, right? This is the plight of the historian, because there's no one left to ask eventually, and no one knows the answers anymore, and certain things will just be lost to time. Another celebrity of the time, this is Jamie Gaze, the one I mentioned, who had worked at the Ad Lib as a stripper as a woman, although he is and was a genetic man. He was the first Miss Gay Wisconsin back in the days of drag pageants. And really these two, this is Josie from our original story of the Black Knight. Josie and Jamie, again, were kind of the club kids of their time. People paid them to show up. It wasn't a party. It wasn't happening. It wasn't legit until these two showed up at your bar. If they don't show up, or if they don't like your bar, you might as well close, because it's never going to succeed. And I can't imagine how much fun these two had, and at the same time, how much they had to put up with and how much danger was in their everyday life. So just to summarize, there were really 5 key transitions in Milwaukee's LGBT history that shaped what we know today as gay life in Milwaukee. World War II veterans returned home. The bachelor lifestyle became an option, and downtown was really booming with nightlife. So a gay neighborhood formed 20 years before Stonewall, just south of downtown. By 1961, after the Black Knight, the gay panic kind of creates a death sentence. People know where the gay bars are now and start harassing them. Tony's Riviera goes up in flames. The rest of the block is deliberately demolished. There's a lot of homophobia in city planning back then, whether it was freeway or urban renewal. Gay bars are also eliminated throughout the city in different neighborhoods by freeways. So everyone moves to Walker's Point, where a second gay village forms at 2nd and Pittsburgh. But by 1974, another massive fire takes out 3 of the 7 gay bars in one night, which was a bit of a tragedy and a whole other story for another day. So that fire, the second Riviera fire, as it were, starts a southern migration to 2nd and National. In 1984, bars start opening windows. 3 bars, including the M&M Club you see here, Lacage, and a bar called First Street, open up their windows, take down the plywood and the bars, and people can see inside and outside for the first time ever, aside from the Mint Bar, of course, where you could do it in 1949. And this kind of creates a trend where straight people start going to gay bars, because being seen there really isn't like a crime or an indictment anymore. It's like you could go to Lacage on a Saturday night in the 80s because you liked the music. You could go to Lacage and meet other straight people because they were there too, because it was the best place to dance and the most fun place in town, or maybe showing the best performances. So this was really a cultural shift. And then, of course, the most destructive cultural shift of all has been really the past decade. Between 2007 and 2017, Milwaukee lost half of its gay bars, even though 3 had opened in 2007. That was the last year when new gay bars really opened, aside from Hamburger Mary's, which I don't count because it's a bit of a bar and restaurant situation, not just a bar. But Milwaukee has lost 50% of its gay bars. There's only 7 left. And if you're asking why, there's a whole lot of reasons, but the main reason is people don't need to go out anymore to meet other people. They can meet them on their phones, and they can have them delivered right to their homes. And the whole element of dating and pursuing hookups has gone digital, so that you don't need to go anywhere to do it. You can just stay home. And then Pride, this is kind of digitized, and I don't know why it looks so crazy. But anyway, just a short reminder that, what we thought was progress in 1969 and 1971 and 1974 and 1978 and 1989 in 1996, this is what gay life in Milwaukee looks like now. And just a reminder that we've come a long way, but there is a long way left to go. The battle for equality is not over. Marriage equality was not the ending. There are so many things going on in the world right now politically, and I don't mean to put politics into this conversation, But the challenges that people faced in 1961, whether they were gender nonconforming women of color or white gay men, still exist. They haven't been exterminated, and unfortunately, it seems it'll be a while before they are. So just the thing to remember is that as we reflect on the way things used to be, please remember that people are still experiencing that today. And with that, I will turn it over to BJ to talk about the new book, which will feature some of these people here who are all very, very tied to Milwaukee's drag history. So BJ, do you want to dive in?
Well, thanks, Michael. So yeah, we, after collaborating with Michael on his last publication, we really realized that there was enough, given my 40-year history in the city, as well as his extensive research into the LGBT community, that we really had enough to tell the story of drag, gender performance, non-gender conforming people, trans people, everyone who was part of that scene. So whether you wanted to call them club kids like Josie or Jamie or people like that who were just out there impromptu in the gay bars of the day, to the professional performers who were doing shows. But the 70s and 80s were out shows. So all of a sudden you were able to do drag, and drag was considered really a major part of the LGBT community, and especially with AIDS, part of your job as a performer was to ignite the community and unite them in fighting the AIDS epidemic, homophobia, and fighting for LGBT rights. So we feel this book has something that young people today especially need to know about the history of gender nonconforming people, all the things that we're experiencing now and we're so much more open about are revealed to us by looking back and seeing the people and the icons that made Milwaukee drag scene what it was. And the 80s was the zenith of that. It really started the shift towards today with RuPaul's Drag Race and Trixie Mattel and Jada Essence Hall and James Mansfield, and the national prominence that some of our performers now have. So we can't wait to preview that to all of you, and that will be coming out in October, this fall.
Yep. So here pictured are just some of the people who'll be featured in the book over the years, some of whom we've mentioned, like Bunny and Jamie, and BJ, BJ himself, but others that will be revealed. So stay tuned. There's a long series of stories left to tell. So just a couple quick things. This is just one presentation, and Pride Month is only 1 month of the year. Please keep in mind that we have a number of ways you can engage with us online. So we do have our website, as mentioned earlier, which is a treasure trove of information. But websites are not, two-way. They're just one way. You can go there, you can read, you can extract information. But if you really wanted to get social about it, there's a couple options. One is following us on Twitter. We try to post interesting information, relevant information every day. Our header picture here is a photo tour of gay bars in Milwaukee circa 1975. Amazing that there were so many. We also have a Facebook page. We try to use this for events and promotions and so forth. And then we have the history group. The history group was started by an outside person not affiliated with the History Project, but we've become very, very close partners since then. And his group is amazing and fascinating, and we're both admins of it now. It's a really great way to crowdsource information and to connect with other people who might have information. I can't tell you how many people come to this group and say, my uncle was a drag performer in Milwaukee in 1971, and I never knew him because he died before I was born. What can you tell me about him? And we were able to connect that person with a recorded interview where she could hear her uncle's voice for the first time. I mean, just amazing stuff. Or someone will come forward with like a matchbook cover or some type of drink ticket or something, and we'll be like, where in the world did this come from? And more importantly, where was this place? So while we're sorting together the mysteries that people like Josie and Bunny have left us when they passed, we're also sorting out new daily mysteries every day from people who join the group with a little tiny piece of gay history that they want to know more about. And sometimes they leave us stumped and create us a whole new mystery to solve. So feel free to join any or all of these. I think you'll enjoy the posts, even if you never post anything yourself, just as a good read. And that's the presentation. So let's see if I know how to turn it off, since turning it on was such a challenge.
Hey, you did great. That was awesome. It's such a, like you said, like a hidden part or untold part of Milwaukee's history that, obviously existed within these greater narratives of the city's history too, which is super cool to uncover. So first I want to talk with BJ, and that is when you first started getting to know Michail and started learning these things. What was that experience like for you? Did you know some of these things already, or what was that like?
Well, no, I didn't know a lot of these things at the time, but the one thing that I can say about Milwaukee at the time that I came here, and that was in the early 80s, was that there was a culture. It was a bar culture. And so that culture, finding more about where that came from, because I was part of the migration to the South 2nd Street location and that part of Walker's Point, moving further south. So the rest of this is fascinating to me. And I did not know about a lot of it. But some things, yes, I did work at Finlandia, which was just a job that I got through a drag queen friend of mine that I performed with, Coco Lopez, Hispanic queen, who worked there. And she said, Hota, it's easy money. You just take money from people. You buzz the buzzer, they come in. And I'm like, sounds great. I'll do it. So I think Michail thought, he was like, you work there? And I was like, yeah. That was like 1982 or 3 that I was there. So it closed, I think, 5 years later.
Yeah, by the time I looked at these, said it was long gone and just a legend. So,
yeah, some of these things that he's uncovered, the earlier things, but from the 80s on, I remember that. And Milwaukee has this rich bar history. It's not only the straight bars, but the gay bars had that same sort of feeling, like the contest for Miss Gay Wisconsin, Mr. Gay Wisconsin, and things like that became sort of competitions between all these bars. And there were, it was an anticipated thing yearly to have these round robins of bar owners. And it was a great community. And I think people really, it brought people together.
Are these stories that we heard tonight, are these unique to Milwaukee? Or are these in every metropolitan area? Are there these kinds of things that are like waiting to be uncovered?
You know what? I don't know if Michail knows this, but there were raids at 219 up until I want to say the last one might have been in the early 90s that I was there. I had to go pick up my friend Tiffany, who was hauled to jail in her costume. And, I was backstage, so I wasn't there, but somebody jumped off the stage and they broke their ankle. And other people were, running, and it was totally an intimidation thing. There was nothing going on. That we were doing like a wet jockey shorts contest. It was like, nothing obscene. It was just, that was it though. But I think after that, somehow in the early 90s, I don't know what happened. It all stopped.
Yeah, I would say BJ struck this point earlier, but it's an important one. And that's that Milwaukee's tavern culture really allowed it allowed a divergent culture for almost every splinter group, every ethnicity, every race. There were taverns for, and then it just diversified further. But there were Polish taverns, and there were Serbian taverns, and there were German taverns, and then there were gay bars, and then there were gay Latino bars, and then there were gay African American bars, and then there were bars that only served, not only served, but catered to gay Latino women. It just.
And a lot of them were like these little corner bars that Milwaukee is famous for.
Yeah.
Right.
But had this proportion of, and every neighborhood, West Dallas, I mean, River West, yeah.
And I
there
think
were tons.
And I think that's very, very unique to Milwaukee, because as I've looked at LGBT history in other cities and attended seminars, workshops, presentations like this one from other historical societies, they had like a little gay neighborhood, and like that gay neighborhood was the place where all the gay places were forever. And then like either it got torn down or it got kind of distributed around the city. And then there were like a handful of gay places all over. There were gay places in Milwaukee distributed, in the 50s. I mean, they were all over town. And I mean, if we didn't have elders like Josie, like Jamie, like Bunny, who were like willing to explore them and do these dangerous things, we wouldn't have known these existed, because none of them advertised. They couldn't advertise, because if anyone who showed up that they actually didn't want to know about the bar, they might be turned in. They would be shut down.
Well,
So
when you were talking about the Mint Bar, when I moved here in the early 80s, that was this little tiny place in the parking lot of the Milwaukee Arena, where you went to concerts and whatever. And the bartender there, who was there for until it closed, was this little woman named Rosie, who was 4 feet tall. I mean, she had a stool that she like manipulated with her to serve you at the bar, and they had pickled eggs, and and then at the other end of the bar was Tracy, who was a trans woman, in a muumuu, and they were the fixtures, and those two were, you look back at this now, that was just amazing that they existed in that space in an odd location in the middle of downtown Milwaukee. It's unbelievable.
And that's another thing that I think Milwaukee has going to its benefit, is that there was a certain aura of weirdness that like we had like a lot of eccentric, unusual characters in Milwaukee that like people remembered, and like for generations would like, run a bar or run a business. And like, I don't think other cities had quite as many as Milwaukee did. And in recent years, we've started losing a lot of those characters. I mean, I can't say, if I can't list any specifically now, but I think that if you talk to anyone who's lived in Milwaukee for a long period of time and you ask them like, tell me about some of the unusual people you remember from over the years, they'll give you a list. And, there's just so much that was unique about Milwaukee's nightlife, and just the whole scene that is slowly kind of fading away. It's like the mainstreaming of gay society, the shrinkage of the gay footprint.
Yes,
and maybe some of the cultural acceptance as well. It just like
it's the difference between now and then.
Yeah, there's no pressure. There's no pressure to be normal anymore. Everyone just kind of is.
Well, everybody had a Cheers bar too then.
Yeah.
You were a regular at M&M's, or you were a regular at your place, which I performed at. And I did know the people that lived upstairs. They came to the shows. So that was this network that now today is digital.
Yeah.
But people traveled. Okay, Tuesday night we're going to go here. Wednesday night is beer bust at this place. And that was kind of how you made this whole circuit in Milwaukee.
Mm-hmm.
And met people.
Yeah. Yeah. I just feel like in recent years, Milwaukee's lost some of the things that made it really unique and unusual, as it's like really strived for mainstream acceptance in the similar way to how the gay community has lost some of its edge as it has become accepted. Do you know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Like the city itself has kind of lost some of its rough edges. And I think that those rough edges were what made it famous. I mean, in my opinion.
I think
that it also provided what all the young people today have, because we did that.
Right.
So, it's having these memories and being able to share this history with your audience and the people that will purchase these books and enjoy them. That's exactly what the History Project is about. It's about preserving that part of it that will probably never return, because things are different and the world is changing, and we accept that. And somebody's going to write a history book, 40 years from now, that's going to be add on to what you're doing, Michael. That's just the truth.
Well, and that's, again, that's the challenge. The first challenge is finding people who actually know something, because there's a lot of hearsay and there's a lot of misremembering, and there's a lot of, how do I say it? A lot of folklore that you have to sort through in many cases. So finding original sources is always really hard for LGBT history, because if people know things, they're not always necessarily willing to share them. And there's a certain amount of, I think, internalized shame that they're still coping with even now. Like the generation that's in their 80s and maybe 90s, they're still coping with internalized shame that was hammered into them for over half, 2/3 their lives. And maybe they don't want to talk about the things they did when they were younger, because they're afraid we'll think that they were, they were bad, or they were damaged, or they were sick. And I mean, nowadays, people just talk about this in open air conversations at Denny's, like the things that they thought were like just horrific indictments of their moral character are now parts of everyone's everyday life. So getting people to talk is the hard part. Getting people to remember is the second part. And then piecing together the historical record, if there is one, is the hardest part. Like I said, Bunny left us with so many little bullet points that made no sense, and we're like, just kind of like, this can't possibly have happened, or this place, there's no record of this place ever existing. And then suddenly one day we'll have this breakthrough, and I'll be like, that's what he was talking about. Every single lead, every lead he's ever given me, every lead any of our sources have ever given us has panned out. And I can't thank those people enough for sharing, the ones who are still alive as well as the ones who've already left us, because their stories leave with them, and we are the worst for it. I said in my book in 2015 that most LGBT people believe that their history begins when they come out of the closet, when they join the community, the first time they go to a gay bar, never knowing that there's been people there before them, that there's this like multitude of experiences. Right. They don't even think about that. Like, they're so self-focused on like the process of becoming, which is not something straight people really relate to or understand. But LGBT people are so focused on this process of becoming their future best eventual selves that they don't think like, the others have gone through this, and others might be able to help me. And I do have a community, and I do have people who've done this before. And they avoid those people for some reason. I think that that's a tragedy. So I think
that's why you're here.
Well, and that's why I think that,
important.
The History Project, presentations like this, walking tours like I'm doing this weekend with Jane's Walk, outreach to employee resource groups and residential centers like we've been doing, all of the media placements, the fundraiser that we're doing in Josie's honor. These are all ways for people to connect to a heritage that their family doesn't even know about. Right. They can't turn to their family and say, if they have come out as trans, like, who are my trans elders? Who's been through this? Like, families don't know how to cope with that. The average family doesn't know how to respond to that. Right. And we have to build a world where they have the resources and the connection points that support is obvious and doesn't have to be discovered.
And
Absolutely.
You know what? People will discover that in our next book, The Golden Age of Milwaukee Drag, because, drag families, the houses, the famous, all those, the drag balls, that's how it all began, really, these families. And these are the people that are sort of representing these decades of chosen family. And
we for sure, we look forward to having that book on our shelves at the Milwaukee County Historical Society. As I did put in the comments while you guys were talking at the end here about Michael's first book too. We have that available. So if people want to pick that up, stop on by, or you can order it online and do curbside, or we'll ship it to you or whatnot too. But I think it is time for us to adjourn for this evening. That was fantastic to both of you. So thank you for joining us and sharing your wealth of knowledge with us. And like you said, Pride Month is not 1 month of the year, so it's more than that. Thank you both. Thank you everybody for tuning in, and we hope to see you all soon in person. Wouldn't that be fun?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. Take it easy, everyone. Have a good night.
Bye.
Thanks.